me see, I'm going all wireless here, so hope this works. Mr. President, Prime Minister Hammond, Prime Minister Johannesson, Ambassador Vasiliev, friends of the Arctic, dear colleagues and fellow conservationists. It's a great honor to address this distinguished audience, and thanks again to the President and to former Prime Minister of Greenland, Kuupik Kleist, and Alice Rogoff for inviting WWF to participate in the conference and to address the plenary. Allow me to get something out of the way first before I get into the heart of the matter, and just briefly address the elephant in the room. As a representative of a fellow civil society organization, I cannot help referring briefly to 30 environmental activists who are in jail because they spoke their minds. And I'd also like to refer to the beautiful words of Ambassador US Senator Lisa Murkowski this morning, referring to the Arctic as a zone of peace. Now, if there is one region on the planet where we need to cooperate, where we need to extend help to each other, and seek non-confrontational dialogue, I think it is the Arctic. And I just don't want to make it into a big thing, but ask you humbly to use your sphere of influence in the next couple of days to bring a peaceful resolution so that they go free and we can actually address the real issues in front of us. It will be highly appreciated. We do what we can, not by confrontation, but by seeking dialogue and a peaceful resolution behind the scenes. I thank you. Now, for those who do not live in the Arctic, there is the 5th report of the IPCC. If you do live in the Arctic or you regularly visit the Arctic, you see the effects of climate change right around the corner. You can't afford being a climate skeptic living in the Arctic. And perhaps Paul Crutzen, the Dutch Nobel Prize laureate, was right when he 13 years ago coined the phrase, ladies and gentlemen, we've left the Holocene and we've entered the Anthropocene. Man is now a geological force among other geological forces. Now that can be a source of desperation, but it could also be a great source of hope and inspiration. If we have become part of the problem, then it's also a matter of choice to become part of the solution. Now, becoming part of that solution means a couple of things. First and foremost, it means a rapid transition to a low-carbon economy. It also means leaving a large share of current fossil fuel reserves unburned. And for my trade, conservation, it means that the old paradigms of conserving nature no longer apply to one of the fastest changing ecosystems on Earth. But there are also immense opportunities. Only last night I came across one. There is a $4 billion investment planned by an Iceland geothermal company into Ethiopia. $4 billion. Now talk about opportunities for low carbon development. That's a fabulous investment. But at the same time, it tells us something else. The proclaimed oil and gas bonanza in the Arctic is a chimera. It is wishful thinking. It won't happen. Under the current state of technology, you cannot safely drill for oil and gas in the Arctic. Full stop. It's not a statement by a conservation organization. It's the prevailing consensus among the major oil companies on this planet. We do not have the technology and the means to do something decent about an oil spill, as we know. There's another reason which I mentioned to you. This path towards a low-carbon economy just tells us that we cannot burn all the fossil fuel reserves that are still available if we want to avoid dangerous levels of global warming man can no longer deal with. Now let's dwell a moment on the old paradigms of conservation and why they need to go as well. The rate of change brings evolutionary processes to your doorstep here in the Arctic. For scientists, there can hardly be a more fascinating time to live and to do research. Because usually you need literature over the ages, and actually within the time frame of a human life, you can see evolutionary processes developing right in front of you. You can study the adaptive capacity of life, and probably the adaptive capacity of life is much higher than we have ever anticipated. The new game is about resilience. It was mentioned before by a previous speaker. Now, what does resilience mean? We all know the word resilience in ordinary speak. We speak about a resilient character as somebody who can deal with disturbances and still function properly. A resilient ecosystem is an ecosystem that can deal with significant disturbances without losing its main functionality or its underlying structure. Now, let's look a little bit on how that ecosystem in the Arctic would look like. And I am, for brevity purposes, speaking about an Arctic ecosystem. But if you would dig a little deeper, there are at least 50 separate, distinct ecoregions described throughout the Arctic with different characteristics. But there are two things here. What is resilience? Resilience is somehow the function of two main characteristics. The one is diversity. And you've heard the conservation community going on about biodiversity and protecting biodiversity since its inception. But the other is productivity. And sometimes you hear people say the Arctic system is so fragile. And sometimes you hear biologists say the Arctic ecosystem is so robust. Both are true. It is phenomenally productive. It's one of the most energy efficient photosynthesis chains we know, from phytoplankton to a large predator like the Icon polar bear. But in terms of diversity, the diversity is relatively low. So if we find places among those 50 ecoregions where diversity is a little higher than the means for that region, and if we find productivity to be spectacular or higher than representative for that region, we know one thing: we must go all out to protect it. So here comes an imperative. We do need an expansive network of marine protected areas and decent spatial planning to protect this legacy for future generations. And we need the best of our scientific brains to make that happen. Allow me my iPad to function again. I wanted to refer to one report of WWF. You know NGOs, we're very good at acronyms. And one acronym we have developed is RACER. Now, how apt is that for the Arctic? And RACER stands for the Rapid Assessment of Circumarctic Ecosystem Resilience. It's a report and a handbook we released last year, and there are a lot of tools available that can help us map those significant regions in the Arctic and go after it to protect it. I'll give you one example at the end of my talk, and I'm coming to conclusion. We need, before you start standing here, it would be really frightening. So we need to do a couple of things, and I mentioned three here. Shift our energy systems to renewables and develop a prosperous low-carbon economy, and we need to do it now. Our window of opportunity is the coming decade. We need to shift old-fashioned conservation practices to ecosystem resilience building. And this requires first and foremost marine spatial planning, zoning, a network of MPAs, and uncompromising protection of critically productive areas and processes, the engines of life and well-being in the Arctic. And last but not least, we must build a robust legal system regulating the many increasing pressures on the Arctic system with the Arctic Council in the lead. That also means we need to abandon a doctrine that was invented by a countryman of mine in the 17th century, known by us as Hugo de Groot, and by Grootjes as many of you, who invented the doctrine of the mare liberum, the sea as a free source of exploration for all of us. That can no longer apply. Then a final example of one of those areas we need to go after with all the resources we have. We call it probably the last ice area. Current modeling tells us that the last sea ice for ice-dependent species, the last refuge, would probably be somewhere between the northwest of Greenland and the northeast of Canada, also within 20, 30 years from now. We must start planning now. It doesn't mean we go for the 20th century approach and announcing a Yellowstone or a Yosemite Park, because it won't be that fixed and it will be in a different way. But we must start our marine spatial planning, specifically in that area, if we want to carry those ice-dependent species with us to a next generation. Ladies and gentlemen, WWF will continue to seek cooperation, serving its constituencies in all the Arctic nations we work from. We continue to seek dialogue and cooperation with business, fellow civil society organizations, government, and academia alike to build a future of prosperity for man and nature in one of the most majestic and valuable last remaining wilderness areas on the planet. Thank you.